Imagine the smoke still rising above the Straits of Salamis. The year is 480 BCE. Broken Persian triremes drift aimlessly in the waters of the Aegean, their crews scattered or drowned beneath the waves. On the shores, Greek soldiers, Athenians, Corinthians, Spartans stand side by side, their lungs filled with salt air, their eyes wide with disbelief. Against all odds, the mighty empire of Xerxes has been turned back. Just 1 year later, at Plataea in 479 BCE, united Greek hoplites drive the Persians from their homeland once more, ending an invasion that threatened to erase Greece from the map. It is a moment of triumph, of shared glory. Yet beneath the cheers and the ringing of bronze shields, a silent question lingers. What happens now? Because even as the Greeks celebrate their survival, cracks are already appearing in the fragile unity that delivered victory. Athens, bold and ambitious, boasts of its navy, the fleet of wooden walls that destroyed Persia's power at Salamis. Sparta, proud and austere, reminds all that it was her hoplites at Plataea who crushed the Persian infantry. Old rivalries stir again, as if the greatest struggle in their history had been nothing more than a pause in the endless quarrels of the polis. This is the reality of Greece in the aftermath of salvation, a land of astonishing brilliance, but also endless division. The city-states, the polis, are fiercely proud of their independence. Each polis has its own laws, its own gods, its own way of life. Athens worships democracy, the assembly echoing with the voices of its citizens. Sparta clings to oligarchy and discipline, where two kings march at the head of a warrior society. Corinth thrives on trade and cunning diplomacy. Thebes, resentful of Athenian pride, watches carefully from the heart of Boeotia. Unity is rare and fragile when it comes. Only when a threat greater than their rivalries emerges, the Persian invasion, for instance, do the polis set aside their pride and stand together. And even then, unity is temporary. In the years following Plataea, the memory of cooperation fades quickly. Already, Athens begins to form what it calls the Delian League, an alliance of states meant to guard against Persia's return. But the treasury is placed not on Delos as promised, but in Athens. The Allies' contributions, once ships and men, become tribute in silver, flowing directly into Athenian coffers. What began as a shield of mutual defense begins to look like an Athenian empire in disguise. Sparta watches uneasily. Its kings and ephors see Athens growing rich, its walls rising higher, its fleets covering the sea. They do not trust this democracy of merchants and sailors. To them, Athens threatens not only Spartan power, but the Spartan way of life. Conflict feels inevitable. And all the while, the problems of Greece remain unsolved. Civil strife, stasis, erupts within the polis as factions battle for dominance. Oligarchs against democrats, poor against rich. Geography conspires against unity. Mountains cut the land into valleys and plains, isolating one polis from another, fostering suspicion rather than trust. Persia, though defeated, still lurks across the Aegean, its satraps ready to stir up Greek quarrels with gold and promises. So here we stand, at the dawn of a century that could have belonged to Greece. A century when her philosophers would shape thought for millennia, when her dramatists would carve the soul of tragedy, when her architects would raise marble temples that touched the heavens. Yet this century would also bring catastrophe, the Peloponnesian War, the collapse of alliances, devastation and plague, and eventually the rise of Macedon, whose kings would conquer the quarrelsome Greeks as easily as snapping a bundle of sticks once broken apart. But what if that was not the story? What if, standing victorious at Plataea, the Greeks chose a different path? What if Athens and Sparta, instead of drifting apart, instead of preparing for the next quarrel, forged a pact, a true federal union, not a sham of tribute and dominance, but a shared empire of city-states, strong enough to endure, flexible enough to preserve their identities, yet united in common purpose? What if the brilliance of the Greek world was not squandered in civil wars, but harnessed in stability? Tonight, we will walk that path together. We will imagine, not a fantasy of conquest, not Greeks ruling the world, but a different kind of strength. A Greece that finds in unity the key to survival, that forges institutions to tame its divisions, that creates a federation durable enough to last. And as we walk this path, ask yourself, how different might the world have been if Greece had learned the lesson of unity, not through defeat, but through choice? Before we begin, if you are captivated by stories like this, histories reimagined, worlds reshaped, be sure to subscribe to What If Wars. Join our community of dreamers and thinkers, where each week we dive into the great crossroads of history and ask, what if? Now, let us return to that field near Plataea, where the ashes of victory still rise, and imagine that as the Persians retreat, the Greeks do not return to their quarrels. Instead, they turn to one another, extend their hands, and take a step toward something unheard of in their world, a shared destiny. But what if, instead of division, they chose unity? In the aftermath of Plataea, a strange quiet settled over the Greek world. The clamor of war had ceased, but no one mistook the silence for peace. Beneath the surface, rivalries stirred, unresolved. Yet amid the rubble of their burnt temples and the fresh graves of their fallen, there was a fleeting moment, a narrow window, when possibility hovered over habit. That moment came in the form of a gathering, not in Sparta too insular, not in Athens too proud, but in Corinth, neutral and wealthy, situated at the bottleneck of trade between East and West. There, in early 478 BCE, representatives from over 40 poleis convened, not to pledge loyalty, but to ask a question none had dared before. Could a people so proud of division dare to be united without being ruled? What emerged from that Congress was not a miracle, nor a utopia, but a charter built not on philosophy or dreams, but on exhaustion, pragmatism, and fear. Fear of Persian return, of internal decay, of another war they might not survive. The structure was simple in appearance, yet radical in implication. A federal dual assembly was formed. One chamber, the Council of Polis, gave every member a single equal voice, regardless of size. Elis stood beside Sparta, Naxos beside Athens. In the second chamber, the Tribute Assembly, votes were weighted by population and contribution, but capped, so no city could dominate. Representation without tyranny, influence without empire. Leadership would no longer rest on prestige or fear. The new federation elected a rotating archonship, alternating between the Doric and Ionic blocks. Every 4 years, the executive administration shifted, not just symbolically, but operationally. The Navy's command would move from Athens to Rhodes, the army from Sparta to Thebes. No one city held power indefinitely. No legacy lasted longer than its term. Disputes between poleis, once settled by arms, would now pass through a federal arbitration court, established at Delphi, sacred and central. Judges rotated by lot from among member cities, sworn to neutrality. They had no soldiers, only precedent, and the force of collective legitimacy behind them. Military contributions were standardized. Each polis submitted forces based on an agreed quota. Athens its navy, Corinth its engineers, Sparta its infantry, Thessaly its cavalry, Crete its archers. Every soldier trained in federal drills, once in summer and once in winter, under shared protocols. No force marched without joint sanction from both assemblies. Unilateral wars became illegal under the charter. Economically, a uniform currency standard was adopted, the Attic tetradrachm. Cities retained the right to mint, but only under federal weight and metal purity. All coinage bore one face, the owl of Athena, but the reverse could bear a city's chosen emblem. Trade became seamless, measured, and trusted. A federal treasury was created, but its physical location rotated every 8 years among 3 cities, Delphi, Corinth, and Delos. Each maintained identical stone vaults built to federal specification, guarded by units from 5 different polis, their officers appointed from opposing blocks to prevent collusion. For the first time in Greek history, grain security was systematized. The Black Sea and Egyptian grain routes were coordinated under federal fleet protection. Member cities were required to hold 6 months of surplus grain, subject to redistribution during siege or famine, as determined by vote. No polis would starve in silence. Infrastructure was no longer a local concern. Roads, ports, and bridges began to follow federal standards. The Diolkos, the ship hallway across the isthmus, was expanded into a paved military corridor. Harbors at Piraeus, Kentriae, and Ephesus were upgraded to dual-use status, servicing both merchant convoys and trireme squadrons. Religious sanctuaries remained under local stewardship, but were designated as federal sacred sites. Olympia and Delphi received funds not just for games and festivals, but for infrastructure and security. Religious pilgrimage became a unifying act where people from rival cities traveled under the same flag, carried the same coin, and ate from the same granaries. A new layer of identity was born, Panhellenic citizenship. It did not replace local citizenship, but added a federal tier. A man from Delos could marry in Corinth and send his son to a naval academy in Athens. Cross-city trade licenses, legal protections, and educational rights were codified and enforced. No city could deny the rights of a citizen from another member polis without federal sanction. Of course, there was resistance. Thebes resisted inclusion, fearing Athenian cultural dominance. Argos demanded historical neutrality clauses. Island Polias feared losing naval autonomy. But the architects of the pact knew when to offer compromise. They allowed special clauses. Thebes retained control over its local Boeotian alliances, provided they remained demilitarized. Argos was exempted from federal troop rotation, but subject to full arbitration rights. Islands were granted dual naval status, able to command their own ships within local waters, but required to follow unified naval law abroad. The Federation was not built on trust, but on checks. Not on love, but on limits. Not on conquest, but on coordination. By 475 BCE, the first federal census was complete. It recorded 3.4 million free citizens and 2.1 million slaves across the Federation. It identified tax tiers, military quotas, and educational enrollment rights. Data became policy. The chaotic patchwork of city-states began to move in rhythm. For the first time, power in Greece was tied to process, not personalities. Still, tensions smoldered. Sparta resented having to answer to votes from seafaring islands. Athens bristled at the limits on its fleet's independent action. Corinth worried that its trade routes would be overregulated. But for every grievance, there was a protocol. For every ambition, a counterbalance. The Federation was not harmonious, but it was functional. And function, in a land that had known only glorious ruin, was revolutionary. The greatest miracle was not that they created a shared government. It was that they agreed to limit themselves before ambition made it necessary. But the test was still to come. Because no paper, no council, no oath survives its first real crisis without strain. And in the years ahead, Greece would face them all: famine, rebellion, invasion, and the seductive pull of old pride. Whether the pact could hold against such storms was not yet known. But for the first time, there was something to test. The early decades of the Panhellenic Federation did not bring peace in the way poets imagined it. There were no golden centuries, no sudden harmony. What they brought instead was structure, a slow and deliberate rhythm, imperfect but constant. After generations of disjointed reaction, the Greek world had begun, at last, to plan ahead. In 474 BCE, the first true test came. A revolt broke out in Euboea. Local oligarchs, emboldened by resentment against federal taxes, seized Eretria and declared secession. In the Old World, Athens would have sailed alone to crush it. Sparta would have hesitated. Other cities might have taken sides. But under the new system, the federal chambers convened within 3 days. By the 7th, a unified military response was authorized, not to burn Eretria, but to isolate it. A blockade was imposed by Rhodian ships. Thessalian cavalry sealed off the land routes, and a delegation of 3 neutral polis, Argos, Delos, and Aegina, was dispatched as mediators. Within 3 months, the rebellion collapsed without bloodshed. No city acted alone. No city fell alone. The lesson was not military, it was procedural. The Federation could be slow, but it could move. And when it moved, it did so with legitimacy. For the first time in memory, a Greek civil dispute had been settled with more ink than iron. In 469 BCE, a new pressure point emerged: Delos. Once the sacred treasury of the gods, the island had become a banking center under federal supervision. But wealthy families in Naxos and Paros accused the Delian magistrates of hoarding interest revenue. Accusations escalated into riots. Ships were seized. Athens demanded intervention, Sparta demanded an audit. Instead of descending into naval confrontation, the Federal Board of Accounts, established only a year earlier, was dispatched with 6 independent assessors. Their ruling was swift and final. Delos would continue to manage the treasury, but its magistrates would rotate biennially, drawn from member cities, and revenue records would be reviewed quarterly. The island's autonomy was preserved, but transparency was enforced. Coins resumed circulation, trade resumed. The treasury remained untouched. The 460s saw the expansion of federal education. With public funds gathered from maritime tariffs, 3 academies were constructed in major cities: Piraeus, Thebes, and Ephesus. Open to all Panhellenic citizens, these schools trained navigators, logisticians, engineers, and jurists, not philosophers or poets, but citizens of function. A merchant from Chalcis could study wind patterns alongside a mechanic from Corinth. The lingua franca of the Federation, Koine Greek, began to standardize in classrooms, contracts, and command structures. By 457 BCE, that shared language would prove essential. Persia, long dormant, stirred again. Satraps in Asia Minor began funding pirate bands along the Aegean. Federal convoys were attacked. One merchant vessel from Rhodes was seized near Samos and its crew executed. The mood in the chamber was furious, but not rash. Instead of a full war vote, the council approved a defensive naval mandate. 90 triremes drawn proportionally from Athens, Naxos, Chios, and Aegina would patrol the eastern Aegean. Their orders: intercept, detain, and if provoked, destroy. Persian agents were warned. When no response came, the fleet moved. Within 2 years, piracy dropped by 70%. No tribute demanded, no cities annexed, only lanes secured. In 452 BCE, Sparta itself became the center of crisis. A Helot uprising erupted near Mount Taygetus. Unlike past revolts, this one was well organized, fueled by promises of Persian gold and rumors of liberation. Sparta, proud and reserved, would once have refused outside aid, but this time she appealed directly to the Federation, not in shame, but under oath. The chambers voted, not for occupation, but for containment and relief. Corinthian engineers fortified Sparta's river crossings. Athenian doctors arrived to treat the wounded. Argive negotiators attempted to fragment the rebel alliance. In a gesture unthinkable a generation earlier, Cretan archers patrolled Messenian fields under Spartan command. The uprising was crushed, not with cruelty, but control. Helots were resettled, not slaughtered. Federal arbitration prevented mass reprisals. The impact was not merely political, it was psychological. For centuries, Sparta had stood alone. Now it stood not weaker, but more secure, because it was not standing alone at all. By 445 BCE, the Federation initiated its first infrastructure cycle. Roads connecting Thessaly to Boeotia were upgraded. The Diolkos was rebuilt with stone rails capable of hauling 3 triremes side by side. Granary systems along the isthmus were synchronized. Public waterworks expanded in Sicyon and Mytilene. These were not projects of ambition, they were projects of necessity, made possible only by pooled resources and pooled labor. Throughout these decades, the specter of Peloponnesian War remained in the minds of all. The differences between Athens and Sparta did not disappear. Their values, their cultures, their rhythms, still distant. But the mechanisms of the Federation prevented rupture. When Athens sought to expand settlement rights in Thrace, the council rejected it. When Sparta proposed an embargo on certain Aegean wines to protect Peloponnesian growers, the vote failed, but no war followed. Disappointment replaced declaration, debate replaced defection. In 435 BCE, a seismic shift occurred in the western seas. A conflict broke out between Corcyra and Corinth over the control of Epidamnus. In the past, such disputes had escalated into proxy wars. Now, they triggered an emergency session of both chambers. After 12 days of deliberation, a compromise was reached. Epidamnus would be administered under temporary federal trusteeship. Neither Corinth nor Corcyra would claim it until a local referendum, supervised by federal observers, could be held. It was held. The people chose Corcyra. Corinth accepted the result. There was no fleet launched, no embargo declared, no ships burned in vengeance. By 420 BCE, the Federation had grown from 40 city-states to nearly 80. Each new member underwent a standard review, economic stability, legal compatibility, defensive capacity, and oaths of non-aggression. There were no forced admissions, no occupied territories. Expansion occurred not by conquest, but by incentive. In those first 80 years, 3 major civil conflicts were prevented. 4 maritime piracy waves were contained. 17 internal legal disputes were arbitrated. Trade volume across the Aegean increased by 43%. Literacy rates among military cadets rose. No member polis declared war on another. And most importantly, there was no Peloponnesian War. It was not utopia. Disputes flared, factions conspired, cities schemed, but they did so within a structure. Pride existed, but it moved through channels, not swords. The Federation did not eliminate ambition, it redistributed it. It did not end division, it gave it a forum. It did not create peace, it regulated tension. This was not the world the poet sang of, but it was a world that endured. And for the Greeks, who had long worshipped brilliance and perished by ego, endurance was the more radical victory. By the early 4th century BCE, the Panhellenic Federation had become something the ancient Greeks had never known: predictable. Ships left port knowing their routes would be safe. Merchants drafted contracts enforceable across hundreds of miles. Generals consulted not omens, but strategic maps drawn with data from shared archives. The Aegean no longer pulsed with chaos, but with calculation. Trade flourished. Grain imports from Egypt and the Black Sea were no longer seasonal gambles, but tightly managed quotas. Federal grain fleets were scheduled quarterly. At Piraeus, Mytilene, and Ephesus, storage depots rotated stock to maintain freshness, with surpluses redistributed when regional droughts struck. The market no longer dictated survival by whim. Athenian ceramic exports reached farther than ever before. Corinthian bronze work became standardized in quality through shared apprenticeships. Olive oil from Argos, dyed linens from Delos, and silver from Laurium circulated through a federal tariff system that encouraged flow over hoarding. Price volatility dropped. A farmer in Thessaly could now project profit margins 2 seasons ahead. Coin forgery declined, punished not only by polis law, but federal sanction. Currency held meaning beyond city walls. Political life shifted. Polius still held elections and trials, still debated in assemblies and punished in courts. But the rhythm of local politics now pulsed within the larger heartbeat of the Federation. Decisions had to answer, not just to local citizens, but to intercity agreements, quotas, and expectations. Democracy did not fade, it adapted. In Athens, citizen assemblies learned to send envoys to argue not only with neighbors, but to build coalitions inside the dual federal chambers. In Sparta, the ephors gained procedural discipline, their decrees subject to review in Delphi if contested by a supermajority of allied polis. Tensions remained. In 398 BCE, Athens proposed a naval budget increase to expand patrols into the western Mediterranean. Sparta countered, claiming overreach and loss of strategic focus. The debate lasted 4 months. The final vote passed, but with a concession. Half the budget would be spent on fortifying eastern coastal outposts vulnerable to Persian resurgence. Neither city got everything. Neither city lost face. The system bent, but did not break. Culture thrived in unexpected ways. Philosophy moved outward from Athens. The academy established a sister school in Thebes, funded partially by a federal cultural grant designed to disperse intellectual influence. Philosophers from Rhodes and Delos published dialectics under joint polis insignia. The idea of shared truth gained weight, even in a land once addicted to contradiction. Religious festivals became arenas of diplomacy. At Olympia, not only were athletic victors crowned, but trade disputes arbitrated, civic honors exchanged, grain pledges signed. Ritual merged with pragmatism. Identity became layered, no longer just Athenian or Spartan, but Panhellenic. Even the arts evolved. Dramas once confined to Attica found voice in other cities. Theaters in Corinth and Rhodes began producing epics centered not on war or betrayal, but on negotiation, loyalty, and the tension between duty and independence. Tragedy, once built on downfall, now explored endurance. Education was no longer a privilege of the elite. Federal academies offered tuition to cadets, engineers, scribes, and navigators from smaller polis. Military academies introduced a common curriculum of tactics, logistics, and ethics. Epaminondas, once a mere Theban noble, rose to lead a cohort of pan-federal strategoi, revolutionizing battlefield coordination by integrating peltasts, cavalry, and phalanxes into a single adaptive command. Innovation spread. Naval engineering advanced through joint research. The trireme evolved into the tetrare. Standardized sails, hull measurements, and port-loading cranes reduced ship turnaround times across federated harbors. Science, long a scattered pursuit, found institutional homes. In Ephesus, astronomical charts were jointly sponsored by 3 polis. In Athens, a shared observatory trained astronomers from 11 cities. Metallurgy labs in Corinth improved bronze ratios using data gathered from multiple workshops. Collaboration became currency. But beneath the surface, old pressures gathered. Cultural dominance bred quiet resentment. Smaller polis, though formally equal, found themselves imitating Athens in speech, fashion, and schooling. The Doric tongue softened. Ionic drama became national theater. To some, the Panhellenic citizen began to look suspiciously like an Athenian in disguise. Rural regions voiced concern over urban centralization. Grain prices were stable, but often too low to benefit local producers. Complaints emerged that Thessalian farmers bore the costs of subsidy, while island merchants reaped the margins. The issue was raised in chambers, debated but left unresolved. Naval dominance sparked unease. Despite joint command, Athenian crews staffed over 60% of the Federation's triremes by 380 BCE. Officers from Naxos and Chios began to petition for equal leadership quotas. Some naval academies quietly introduced rotation reforms. Others resisted. The military doctrine began to diverge. While the federal army trained for joint tactics, Spartan elders lobbied for a return to heavier infantry formations, citing Helot unrest as justification. Athenian strategists favored mobility and lightness, adapted to piracy suppression. Field drills became contentious. Simulations were staged, complaints filed. Each time the court in Delphi mediated, slowly, but with authority. And yet, despite frictions, the system endured. By 370 BCE, more than 100 polis had ratified the federal charter. Civic archives in Olympia recorded over 200 interpolis treaties processed, 35 military operations executed jointly, and 14 confirmed interventions in internal stasis that had de-escalated without foreign involvement. The Federation had prevented a second Persian invasion. It had suppressed piracy, neutralized internal rebellion, and harmonized coinage, education, infrastructure, and trade. It had not conquered foreign lands. It had not colonized. It had simply lasted. And in a world that once destroyed its best minds in civil war and its best cities in pride, lasting was the most radical achievement of all. But shadows gathered at the edge of the map. Macedon watched. Persia recovered. Carthage expanded quietly westward. The world beyond Greece did not stand still. The question would soon shift, not whether the Federation could hold itself together, but whether it could withstand the weight of what pressed from beyond. The storm had not yet arrived, but the winds had begun to shift. History did not remember a united Greece. It remembered Thermopylae, but forgot the council at Corinth. It remembered Salamis, but not the quiet arguments that followed. In our world, the city-states that had defeated the greatest empire of their time turned inward again. Athens rose, Sparta resisted, war erupted, and Greece consumed itself. The Peloponnesian War lasted nearly 3 decades. Cities were burned, alliances shattered, democracy collapsed into tyranny, and tyranny into oligarchy. Plague swept through Athens. Sparta, victorious but hollowed, never recovered. And in the shadows, a new power watched, patient and young. Macedon. By the time Greece looked up, it was too late. Philip came not as a liberator, but as a surgeon. He cut through the noise, dismantled the quarrels, and declared a unity forged by conquest, not negotiation, not choice. When Alexander crossed into Asia, it was not under the banner of free cities, but of one man's will. And yet, it did not have to be that way. In another timeline, a federation stood where chaos once ruled. It was not a utopia. There were no perfect laws, no ideal citizens. The cities remained themselves, stubborn, proud, distinct. But they had chosen to submit part of their strength to a shared order. They had learned to compromise before being conquered, to speak before they bled, to endure even when brilliance tempted them toward rupture. Their unity did not make them identical. It made them resilient. In that world, Thebes was not razed. Athens was not humiliated. Sparta did not fade into irrelevance. Macedon did not need to intervene. The Greek world spoke with many voices, but through one structure, and because of that, it remained whole. Perhaps the greatest lesson is not political, it is psychological. That pride, in its noblest form, does not resist cooperation, it protects it. That strength is not found in dominance, but in stability. That a civilization can be brilliant and still bound by rules. We often think of Greece as the birthplace of reason, of democracy, of beauty, but perhaps its most radical contribution could have been endurance. If only it had chosen to wield its gifts together rather than against one another. In every age, the temptation returns to stand alone, to guard borders, to reject dialogue. The polis lives in all of us, in the ways we define us and them, in the walls we build to feel safe, in the pride that masks fear. But the Federation reminds us that walls can be connected and pride redirected, not erased, but aligned. That unity is not the enemy of identity. That power shared is not power lost. That what survives is not what dominates, but what adapts. If you found meaning in this story, if it made you wonder, reflect, or dream, then we invite you to stay with us. Because history is not a fixed road. It's a web of paths barely taken, and together we ask the questions that still echo across time. Subscribe to What If Wars, where history doesn't end, it bends, where we explore not just what was, but what could have been, and what it still might mean for us. We'll see you in the next timeline.